Welcome to Bug Banter with the Xerces Society, where we explore the world of invertebrates and discover how to help these extraordinary animals. If you want to support our work, go to xerces.org/donate.
Hi, I'm Rachel Dunham in Missoula, Montana.
And I'm Matthew Shepard in Portland, Oregon.
Given the name of our podcast, it is no surprise that we talk a lot about bugs. But today we are stretching our invertebrate muscles and looking at a group of invertebrates that we haven't considered before, mountain snails. To help us learn more about these fascinating animals is Dr. Lusha Tronstad. Lusha is the Invertebrate Zoology Program Manager for the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database at the University of Wyoming. The WNDD program is responsible for developing and maintaining data on the distribution, natural history, conservation status, and habitat requirements of rare invertebrate species in the state. Lusha has a Ph.D. in zoology and physiology from the University of Wyoming and is interested in food webs, invasive species, conservation, bioassessment, and biogeochemistry while working in aquatic ecosystems and with pollinators. Welcome, Lusha. We are very excited to have you here today and to talk about mountain snails.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about some of my favorite snails.
Before we get into talking about mountain snails, I'd like to start with looking more broadly at snails. I mean, first, sort of thinking about some of the really basic stuff, how many different types of snails are there in North America?
There's nearly 3,000 species of snails in North America, and there's land snails and aquatic snails, so that includes both of those.
And I mean, are there any areas where we're more likely to find snails? I'm thinking, are there regional differences, or I'm sure there are habitat differences too?
Oh, yes, they live in a lot of different places, and I should have said marine as well. There's, snails almost everywhere.
And in thinking about snails, I mean, how are snails classified? Like butterflies are the order Lepidoptera and beetles are Coleoptera. And where would snails be within that kind of tree of life?
Yes. Well, they're all animals, insects, snails, mussels, but snails are mollusks, and that includes both mussels or other bivalves and snails, gastropods. Gastropods is a class, and like I said, that includes land snails, aquatic snails, marine snails, even slugs. And so quite a variety of critters in that class.
Yeah. And the gastropods, do they have any kind of unifying characteristics? And again, I'm thinking Lepidoptera means scale wing. So we know that, and the Coleoptera are the shield wings. So I mean, gastropod must have a meaning as well.
Yes, I believe the Latin meaning is stomach foot, which, they have a single foot, and a lot of their organs are in their foot. So I believe that's where the Latin name comes from. But their unifying characteristics include, a single foot, a single shell that's often coiled, and they also have a radula, which is their mouth part, and that's how they scrape algae. Say the aquatic snails scrape algae off of rocks, or terrestrial snails scrape microbes off of leaves and things like that. But snails are very diverse. Some do have a coiled shell, some are limpets, look more like a little volcano. And then slugs, a lot of them do have shells. They're internal, so their shell has retracted because they're all related in the past, and even some slugs don't have shells. They've lost that.
I remember reading about the semi-slugs, which do still have a residual shell on the outside. And there's the ear shell slug, which is not native, but I found in my front garden here one day. So there are all sorts of odd creatures out there. And I'm thinking, when you mentioned the radula, I was remembering when I used to do more education and docent work with a local state park here, and it was described as being like a file. And so that's how we used to try and explain it to people. So imagine going out having to use a file to scrape at everything.
It's funny because I used to work at the Seattle Aquarium and we talked about moon snails, and their radula was like a drill. They'd drill into other shells of animals and slurp them up like a Slurpee. And the kids are always like, oh, gross. But yeah, snails are so diverse and they're such cool animals. But your experience we're talking about today is with mountain snails. Are they a large group of snails?
They're not I mean, they're fairly large, I guess, relatively. So we're talking about mountain snails, like you said, they're in the family Oreohelicidae, and there's two different genera in that family. And so we're going to be talking about the one, Oreohelix, and there's about 85 different species that I could find for the mountain snails. And there's a lot of taxonomic disagreement about this. The thing about snails is that their shells, the morphology, the shape of their shell, it really changes based on where they're at. Temperature, elevation, how dry it is, all these environmental characteristics can change that. And so a lot of times we base the species designation on how their shell looks. And so we know the taxonomy of Rocky Mountain snails is wrong because a lot of it is based on these shell characteristics. And so because we've used shell, we have a lot of species. One species will live in this canyon, another one's only on this mountain. And so we have a lot of species that live in very, very small areas. And so they're considered rare. But we don't know if that's true. So, we need to look further to see how many species there really are.
Like a lot of other invertebrates, there's still some that we're discovering, which seems pretty wild. But for mountain snails, you mentioned the Rocky Mountain snails. Are there snails in every mountain range across the U.S.?
Oh, excellent. So mountain snails live in the western United States. They'll range from southern Canada down to Mexico. They're very small and they're usually hiding. So we have to look for them to find them. Sometimes I won't find snails in really dry habitats, but there are snails a lot of places.
And you mentioned that their shells are different, and that's how you classify them. And you said there's a lot of factors that determine the shell differences. Do mountain snails have a unique shell? It seems like every species has a different type of shell, but are they collectively different from non-mountain snail shells?
Oh, yeah. So I brought a shell. So mountain snails have a very compressed shell. So it looks like it's squished top to bottom. And you can tell it's much rounder on the top. They even have a belly button if you look on the bottom. A lot of times they'll have two stripes, dark brown stripes that run around the shell.
Is there any evolutionary advantage to sort of that smashed shape? Because when I think of a snail, I imagine like the really tall, almost like a top of an ice cream cone, like a soft serve, where it's like swirly and large and like a little hat.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Snails come in all shapes and sizes, but generally they're either compressed top to bottom or more compressed side to side. You're right. I bet most people probably do think of the elongate ones, but a lot of snails are compressed top to bottom. And I'm not sure. I've never read anything about evolutionary advantages of that. I can tell you that they have some mechanisms to survive. Mountain snails do live in drier habitats a lot of times, and they will make a plastic wrap on the outside of their shell. So the aperture, the opening there, they'll put plastic wrap it's made of mucus, but it reminds me of that. And they'll put that over their shell opening during drier periods. And that helps them retain the moisture in their bodies so they can survive.
It's a perfect segue because I was wanting to talk more about the kind of habitat and the natural history. But with the mountain snails, do they have any particular habitats that they prefer? You mentioned drier conditions, you've mentioned forests so far. Is it dry forests? They must have some preference for themselves.
Well, yes, but then we can find exceptions to every rule, right? So usually they're in mountains. They are usually in forests, but there's some species that live in sagebrush in really dry habitats. So they are a lot of different places in the western United States. What I would say maybe is a more unifying characteristics of their habitat would be these microhabitats they find. They tend to find places that just little places they can hide that are wetter. It might be a north-facing slope on a mountain that has, it's just cooler and more moist. It could be under bushes at the understory. It's really important that they can find that wetter, cooler spot. So they kind of find those little spots in the environment that they can survive in.
I used to live in Britain, and I know that there I would see more snails in areas with chalk or limestone because the plants had higher calcium content. Do you find that same kind of relationship with the snails here?
Definitely. Yes. They need calcium in order to make a shell. And so when I go out to do surveys, one of the first things I'll do is get a geology map for the area and look at where the limestone pockets are. And it could be other types of rock like dolomite or whatnot that have calcium in them, but that's where they are. For example, right now I'm in the Tetons, and the Tetons are largely granitic, which has no calcium. But if you look at a geologic map, there's little pockets of dolomite or limestone out there. And if you go to those places, I found them.
How long does a mountain snail live for?
That's a really good question. So we did a study a few years ago where we went out and we marked snails every year, once a summer, and we come back and we try to find individuals. So it's called a mark recapture study. And the longest living individual we found was 7 years, but they might live longer. Yeah. We also found that they moved 80 meters in a year at one snail.
80 meters. I'm like, that's not very far per hour, though, is it?
I mean, they're an inch and they have 1 foot. So, and I was measuring straight line distance, and I don't know how many.
Up and down. Right. Yeah, totally. And I'm like, wow, they live for 7 years, and they
At
have
least
to survive. They have to survive the winters. I mean, are there times of the year, like in Wyoming or any of the mountains, are they more likely to be active at any particular time of year?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Yeah, so they have to survive these harsh periods, and they have adaptations to do that. So in the wintertime, they hibernate. They make that, mucus lining on the outside of the shell again to cover up the outside, and then they reduce their metabolic rate to, survive these cold times with snow cover. And so that's how they do that. But then in the summertime, it gets really hot. And the biggest factor for snails is desiccating, drying out, becoming a raisin. And so what they do is, again, put that mucus membrane over the outside of the shell. We call it estivation when it's hot. And so they do that. But what I've noticed is that they can wake up really rapidly. If it starts raining and conditions get a little wetter, they can respond really fast, and they start feeding and drinking. And then when it dries out again, they'll put that mucus membrane up on their shell again. They definitely have a lot to deal with.
Yeah. You mentioned that they can react very quickly to changes in moisture. Does that mean that in the middle of the summer, a thunderstorm goes over and makes it wet? Is that enough to trigger that activity?
Yes, I've seen them arouse after a thunderstorm and start becoming active. You'll see them crawling around on the rocks or the leaf litter and, get a drink, eat.
I admit I don't know anything much about mountain snails, but I have discovered that their egg laying is different from other snails that I've encountered. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, yes. So most land snails are hermaphrodites. So they possess both female and male organs, whereas most aquatic snails are separate. They have separate females and males. So that's kind of unique about land snails. And then within that, most snails lay eggs. Think of a fish laying eggs outside their body and letting them develop, whereas most snails also do that. They lay eggs and they develop without any parental care. They're on their own. But Oriohelix, they have internal fertilization of the eggs, and then they have an internal brood chamber that they rear the young, and they actually give live birth to baby snails. And they're about 2.5 whorls. And that's the way we measure age in snails, is how many times the shell goes around. And so 2.5 whorls, the shell goes around 2.5 times. That's about the size when they're born. And so this is a lot of parental care. The mountain snails can protect their young against both environmental harshness and protect them from predation and a lot of other things by internally taking care of them.
That's amazing. And I'm guessing this is an adaptation to living in extreme environments, is it?
I think so. Yeah, that would be my guess as well. They have a lot of parental care. Instead of laying 1,000 eggs and hoping for the best, they're actually taken care of them, they produce far fewer young. They might produce 5 or 10 uh, instead of 1,000, but the chance of survival for those 5 or 10 is much, much higher.
Yeah. If the eggs are fertilized internally and there's a brood chamber, are the baby snails developing whilst the mother is kind of in estivation or hibernation?
Well, I mean, I believe I've picked up estivating snails that are, if you want to say, pregnant. So I believe that they can.
Yeah, I guess it just makes it one advantage is that the very short active season, the young also have the best opportunity to maximize the time.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Wow.
That's so cool. Tiny little baby snails. In your work with the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database, you develop and maintain data on rare invertebrate species in the state. Are mountain snails, I'm assuming, are part of these studies?
Yes. So I'm working with some colleagues and we're trying to raise funds to do a project to revise the taxonomy. So figure out what the species are and how many of them are rare versus how many of them are widespread. And so I started with Oreohelix about 17 years ago when I got my job at, we call it WIND. And I started learning about them. And a lot of species across the West are considered rare. There's around 85 species out there, and over half of them are considered of management concern or of conservation concern by state and federal agencies because they live in these really tiny little areas, like I said, that mountain or on this ski slope. So because they live in such a small area and there's very few of them, that's a definition of rarity for conservation ranks. And so I realized pretty quickly in Wyoming that we couldn't really do much for these snails until we realized, is this a valid species or not? And so I started working with some colleagues to do this. And if you want to do it, you have to do it across their entire range, which means the West United States. So that's what we're hoping to do if we can find the funds to do that. Yes, we have rare species across the West that are of Oreohelix. A very, very high percentage of them are considered rare.
So obviously there's more data that needs to be collected, but as you said, half of them are of concern, and being rare kind of already puts them in a vulnerable state. What are the threats that these mountain snails face?
Yeah, I think a large one is, well, we have a couple things that are probably harder on them. One is, rising air temperatures and drying conditions. That's a big thing. When you live on a mountain, you can only run up so far to get to cooler habitats. So that's one thing. And then changing precipitation patterns and things like that, they need the moisture. Like I said, one of the things that they worry about is becoming a raisin. And so drying out. And so if we don't get as much moisture, if we have more and more of these prolonged droughts, that is going to make life tougher for a mountain snail. Another thing is they depend on those microhabitats, like we were saying. And so when we log and remove understory and or overstory, we're losing a lot of those microhabitats that keep them cool and wetter. And so, understanding what the minimum amount of cover of overstory and understory is in forests will be important moving forward to make sure we maintain these populations.
Yeah, it's talking about the inconsistency of moisture. I'm obviously in Missoula, those of us who live in the mountains, the amount of snowpack we've had, even in the past few years that I've lived here, has been wildly different from year to year. And I imagine that's so stressful for a mountain snail to not be able to depend on that consistency, well, especially since they live up to 7 years and maybe longer.
And the snow is also a very insulating factor for all of our invertebrate friends that live, in the soil or on the ground, because the more snow we have, the more they're insulated from those varying temperatures. And so there's a lot of factors that come with varying snowpack.
Is there anything that people can do to help protect mountain snails or snails in general? Is there anything that folks can do to improve that habitat? I imagine like recreational users when we're on the mountains. Is there something we can be mindful of?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But again, these aren't in our yards for the most part. So it is when we're out mainly using and recreating, and anything that runs over the ground, like off trail driving, four-wheelers and things like that, could crush them. And if you look under a log to see who lives there, put it back because it's home to a lot of critters. I always think about that, or rocks. I think being advocates for more information about things like what is the minimum tree canopy or understory canopy that we need to leave in order for Oreohelix and other animals to survive. I think being an advocate is huge. Noticing them and telling others about them, because I want to call these charismatic microfauna because they're big enough that people notice them. I see kids picking the shells up all the time in the forest, the long dead, very white shells. And so I think it's an opportunity for people to notice invertebrates, animals that are in the forest. They are wildlife, they are animals, and they are part of what makes the ecosystem work. They're there breaking down organic matter like leaves and things. They have a job and they're an important part of the ecosystem. And so I think getting the word out that yes, invertebrates are wildlife and they matter is important.
Quite a few states, even within the legislative structure, they don't allow you to protect invertebrates. So Invertebrates
Yes.
of Wildlife has been one of our campaigns that we've been developing over the last couple of years to try and fill the gaps, at least at the legislative level, state by state. But I think what you were saying as well about the individual actions that we can take to be more aware, more careful when we're out, because we're not always noticing the damage that we cause. And I know there's the leave no harm, leave no trace kind of attitude that they take, but that's not always thinking about what you're squishing underfoot. And those are the kind of the small details that will make so much difference to small animals. But the next question I have for you is, I don't know if there is an easy answer, but do you have a mountain snail that you're particularly fond of all of the mountain snails that are out there?
Well, yeah, it's hard, but I'm going to say the two that I've worked on the most. And the one is the Cooper's mountain snail, which lives in the Black Hills. I've surveyed and monitored it since 2010, a few times over the years. And that's a good example of the taxonomic issues because there's somewhere between 1 and 3 species up there, but we don't really know. My other favorite snail is Oreohelix subrutus, and that snail lives in the mountains behind my home in the Snowy Range of southeastern Wyoming. And those are the species that I worked on to measure how far they moved and how long they lived.
Awesome. I love how many different types there are. So thank you so much for all the wonderful information about mountain snails. I feel like I just want to keep asking you questions and learn more. I'm so grateful that we had this time with you. And we're going to end on our 2 questions that we ask folks. And this one's my favorite. So I'm glad I get to ask you. What inspired you to pursue a career in invertebrate conservation?
That's an excellent question. I think it all started with my family and my brother. So as a child, I grew up in northwestern Montana, and we went fishing in the mountains every weekend and on Thursdays with my dad. And when the fish weren't biting very well, I would get out of the rubber raft and wade in the ice cold streams and just pick up all the rocks and look at the bugs. My brother showed me all the aquatic insects that lived on the rocks. And so I would just spend hours picking the rocks up and looking at the invertebrates in the stream. And I think that's what got me started. And eventually I went to college thinking I could be a biologist, like fisheries biologist. And I got there and I found out that you could study invertebrates for a living. And right away I got a job in a lab, and I learned to identify benthic invertebrates that live on the stream bottoms, and went to grad school. I mean, the rest was history. I fell in love with invertebrates. And when I got my job at Wind, my scope opened a bit because I am still responsible for all the invertebrates in the state of Wyoming. And so that includes pollinators and mussels and snails and all the insects and all the invertebrates in the state. I think one thing that I love about that is I love learning about different animals and where they live and how they live. And I think that's one of my favorite parts about my job.
I think it's symbolic somehow of the approach and the attitude people have to insects and invertebrates, that you're the one person responsible for the biggest group. And they may
Yes.
well have multiple botanists and multiple zoologists and multiple ornithologists, but just you dealing with way more than everybody else.
Oh, yeah. It keeps me very busy. And there could be tens of thousands of species. We don't know. We're just breaking the tip of the iceberg here.
Very last question. If you could see any bug, any insect, invertebrate in the wild, what would it be?
Oh, that is such a tough question because like I said, I love diversity and I love learning about so many different invertebrates. I would go and see any of them. But since we're on a mountain snail theme today, I'm going to say Oreohelix pillsburyi. And that is a mountain snail that lives in New Mexico. And it is currently being considered for federal protection. And so I would like to go see that snail. And it looks like it's a bit of an adventure to get there. So I like adventure, hiking and whatnot. So I think I would choose that one.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and teaching us about mountain snails. And thank you for the work that you do and trying to protect these important animals and just bringing awareness to our audiences about them. So next time I'm out hiking, I'm going to look for some mountain snails and see if I can find some. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bug Banter is brought to you by the Xerces Society, a donor-based nonprofit that is working to protect insects and other invertebrates, the life that sustains us. If you are already a donor, thank you so much. If you want to support our work, go to xerces.org/donate. For information about this podcast and for show notes, go to xerces.org/bugbanter.